afternoon, and welcome to the latest installment of the National Security Space Association's SpaceTime interview series. My name is Chris Williams, and I'm honored to serve as the chair of NSSA's Moorman Center for Space Studies. We're delighted to have with us today Ms. Joyce Corell. Joyce serves as the senior technology advisor to the National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis. Her impressive career includes senior positions at the National Counterintelligence and Security Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and at the National Security Agency, where she focused on defensive and offensive computer network operations and other critical national programs and activities. At NCSC, Joyce spearheaded efforts to mitigate supply chain risks and bolster the IC's posture for defending against cyber threats. Some of her more recent efforts have included working on some of the semiconductor supply chain disruptions that have been affecting both civilian and military operations, and certainly those in defense industry. Joyce, we're so glad to have you with us for what I believe is your third SpaceTime interview. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
On a personal note, I've had the great privilege of working with Joyce going back 20 plus years when she held a key position in the Commercial Solutions Center at the National Security Agency. She's smart and hardworking, and let me say, we need more Joyce Corells in the federal workforce. The same can be said about her outstanding boss, Chris Inglis. Chris is a true national hero, and I'm proud to call both friends. In her opening remarks, Joyce will discuss the role of the Office of the National Cyber Director in helping coordinate U.S. government cyber programs and activities, as well as assist American companies by encouraging adoption of proven best practices to counter cyber attacks and secure our critical networks and infrastructures. We will follow our standard format today. Our esteemed speaker will provide some opening remarks, followed by a question and answer session. Our discussion will end at approximately 2 p.m. today. I would remind members of our audience that you can propose questions to the speaker by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I may not be able to get to all your questions, but I'll certainly do my best within the allotted time. With that, again, Joyce, so glad you could join us today. Thanks for taking the time from your busy schedule. And thank you for your tireless efforts in service of the nation. The floor is yours.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. And it's exciting. Yes, this is my third time. This is a topic I'm very interested in. So thank you for having me. I think you can see from my background, I'm not at the White House. This is a brand new White House where we are actually able to telecommute from all different kinds of locations. So it's interesting what we've learned from an IT perspective on how work can get done. So I am on an assignment at the White House. I'm privileged to be at the Office of the National Cyber Director, helping to stand up a brand new organization. So I'm excited to actually be able to talk to you a little bit about this particular organization. Some of you may already be very familiar with the organization. A couple of 3 or 4 years ago, Congress determined that members of Congress determined that they were a bit frustrated with how the executive branch had been dealing with cyber attacks and the fact that the nation had been under siege from constant threats to our private sector, through cyber as a threat vector, adversaries stealing intellectual property, bringing networks down and things using ransomware as a means to extort organizations. So a decision was made that there needed to be a reevaluation of how we as a country look at cybersecurity, from a national security, from a whole of nation perspective, and not just whole of nation, but how we think through cybersecurity from a defense of the nation, from the economic security, economic health, what our digital society looks like, and how we actually, work with our partners and allies when we need to, given current events. So one of the outcomes of the study of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission was a recommendation that there be a centralized single point of coordination for cyber issues. And thus legislation was passed to create the new Office of the National Cyber Director. So the legislation was passed out of the National Defense Authorization Act, and the organization was created in 2021. Chris Inglis, who was one of the commission members, was presidentially nominated, Senate confirmed candidate. And last summer, a little over a year ago, he was confirmed as the new national cyber director. I joined his team in September. As my first job title, I tell people, was employee number 6, because it was totally a startup organization. So fall last year, it's been a slightly over a year that the organization was established. It didn't have a budget. The legislation passed just authorizing the organization, but no appropriations had followed through with that authorization. And the appropriations didn't actually come in until November of last year. So for those of you who are on either the government or the private sector side of government appropriations, you know how that works. It's an odd thing to get money so late in the fiscal year. So we have spent the first year establishing the actual organization, and this is actually the first time in maybe over a decade that the White House has established a brand new organization. So we had a lot of the entrepreneurial fits and starts that organizations have. I can recall, coming into work one day and having to run to a meeting with a stack of papers and having to run next door to knock on the door and ask if I could borrow a paper clip from a fellow office, because we didn't even have supplies at the time. So, that's what startups are all about. When we were established, Chris English sort of set the vision for the organization, and his philosophy was quite clear. That we're a strategic organization. We're not performing operations. We're not conducting operations, but we are looking strategically across the entire cyber domain to look at what issues we can embark upon and what things that we will tackle that can achieve 4 basic outcomes. So I'll discuss those in a second. We've spent the first part of the year really doing those startup activities, hiring people, the entire process of writing the job descriptions to be able to then issue a vacancy to hire someone into the organization. And we had to do very, very basic things like hire a general counsel, hire a legislative affairs officer, a public affairs officer, the staff that can schedule meetings, things of that particular ilk. So those things occupied a significant amount of time so that we could actually build an organization that will be professionally operated and that will created in legislation, will be an organization that, over the next decade, is there through changes in administration, changes in national security posture for the nation, but where we here at the foundation are actually laying the groundwork for a sustainable organization. So we're maybe 70 people, and we have your basic organization strategy and budget, your HR admin. We have responsibilities looking at the federal government, how the federal government is postured to do cybersecurity, how as a nation, looking at how the private sector, the critical infrastructure owner operators are set and resourced to manage cybersecurity, and just looking to the future, emerging technology and what areas in emerging technology we want to be sure that we attend to those to ensure that those capabilities and the promise of those technologies get realized by using good cybersecurity practices. So the 4 areas of focus that we're looking at to ensure that these are I would say guiding principles that inform sort of our daily decisions on activities we get involved in. So one of those is federal coherence. One of the mandates from Congress was that there be some coherence across the entire federal enterprise with regard to how, if an incident occurs, who's first, how do we respond to incidents? How do we work to prioritize the use of cybersecurity monies to do tech modernization. And that resulted in Chris Inglis being identified as the single, the senior leader for federal coherence. In this vein as well, from a federal coherence perspective, the government, we don't make things that from an IT perspective, we buy things from the private sector. So how do we ensure greater transparency and greater synergy for the private sector in dealing with the federal government? So federal coherence is an important outcome that we're looking at achieving. The second area, and these aren't in any kind of priority order, is looking at public and private sector partnerships. And our director, Chris Inglis, has been very clear, from his many years in the government, collaboration between the public sector and the private sector is not about people coming together and party A saying, here's what I'm going to do, and party B saying, and this is what I'm going to do, and just sharing what each party will do. But rather, real, true collaboration is about coming together and all partners sitting side by side in, either in person or virtually, and deriving unique insights from that collaboration that could not have been arrived at with a division of effort. So that's true public-private sector collaboration. The third area of focus is resilience, present resilience and future resilience. So how are we as a nation postured to be resilient with our infrastructure? And when we think about, not just the IT infrastructure or the infrastructure that we currently have, where services ride upon our IT and comms systems, like the financial services sector, or elements of the energy sector, elements of maybe the water sector. IT is the fabric that connects all of these. As a nation, as we evolve from a technology perspective to 5G to 6G, and we see the advantages of that technology and the digitalization of all kinds of services that will ride on top of that infrastructure, how do we ensure that all of those are also secure and resilient? We may never stop all attacks, but how do we operate in a fraught environment? So what does resilience really look like in that context? And in this perspective too, when we think about resilience and the attacks that we have seen, and the burden of responding to these attacks is many times on the shoulders of those who are not really well skilled or well resourced to be able to deal with those attacks. And I think in this particular context, sort of at the state and local level, where small schools are suffering, the scourge of ransomware. These small schools don't have the IT budgets to really have the investment that is needed for really having a robust and a hardened infrastructure for their IT systems. So what does that look like? How do we think through down the road, future resilience, such that the risk is actually not on the shoulders of those who don't have the resources, but rather the burden is taken up by those that are better skilled and better resourced to manage that. And then finally, the fourth outcome that we're focused on, and Chris Inglis is a truly an elder statesman in this context, and he's very diplomatic. And his turn of phrase is that we're looking to align resources to aspirations. And what that actually means is that we do have some budget oversight. So from a federal government perspective, we can look at federal agencies' budgets, and that is sort of the soft power that we have to be able to examine how agencies are spending their resources on managing their IT security for mission success. We don't do cyber because cyber's there for the sake of cybersecurity. We perform these functions to enable the other things that we want to pursue, our own interests and our own aspirations, and that we can do those in a safe environment. So cybersecurity is not an investment in technology, it's an investment in our goals and the way in which we want to pursue those and the aspirations that we are interested in. So those are kind of the four kind of high-level outcomes that we look at. I want to step back a little bit from that and talk a little bit about the threat landscape in a very general context, not to speak about specific threat actors. When we think about adversaries, and we look back in history and from a cybersecurity perspective, and we look at what adversaries have done, you can break sort of that the trends into three basic categories. So the first trend, we saw adversaries coming after our data. So bad actors would look at companies, individual networks owned by individuals, looking to gain access to data, to that unique information, whether it was intellectual property or whether it was data that could be then harnessed for some other, maybe in the military perspective, stealing information about weapons platforms to develop countermeasures. But the adversaries were first and foremost coming after our data. The second wave was that we observed is really adversaries looking at our systems and our systems of systems, how all of our networks are interconnected. And in that examination, looking at seams in those infrastructures to be able to hold our critical infrastructure at risk. But more recently, in probably the last 3 to 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, what we have seen is that adversaries are attacking our confidence. And this is confidence in our systems, confidence in our society, the values we have as a society, confidence in the structures that we value and look at, from like election security, judicial security, those types of things. So how do we now, taking this threat landscape in context, how do we now need to think down the road where we want to go with managing our cybersecurity? We are actually, we were given the pen about, I think in the July-June timeframe, to develop a national cybersecurity strategy. So we're in the process of wrapping that up and getting that on the road, and hopefully that will drive our future.
Take your time.
I apologize for that.
No problem.
That's sort of a basic overview. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I really appreciate it. You guys have your hands full with the standing up a new organization, the Office of the National Cyber Director, hiring new people, figuring out who does what to whom, relationships both internal and external. There's a lot going on in that regard, and I, for one, I know there are a lot of people who share this view. We're thrilled that Chris has the job. He's the right guy for the job at the right time, and I know he's very glad to have you there alongside him, making sure the ship is going in the right direction. So congratulations on that. I really want to pick up on what you were just talking about, Joyce. You talked about the three kind of categories and trends of threats. Initially, we saw going after data, IP, for example, and then secondly, systems of systems to look at vulnerabilities that could be exploited in peacetime or crisis or wartime, and then confidence in systems and values. First, I assume you would agree that they didn't stop doing one to move to the next phase. It's all of the above. It continues to refine itself, if you will. And a broader question in that regard is, the phrase that I have used for a number of years is that our adversaries know more about our strategic vulnerabilities than we do. And I hope that's not the case, but I am concerned about that. And that in turn suggests that we need to be thinking about not a range of things, whether it's regulations that are in place for the private sector or funding that goes to the private sector to try to remedy some of these activities. And so a question for you is, there seems to have been a willingness to slowly but steadily impose more requirements on the private sector, more regulations and legal reporting, for example, of cyber events that occur, et cetera. But there does not seem to be a dramatic increase in funding that has gone to various organizations for, for hardening their networks, enhancing resilience, et cetera. And I wonder if if you agree with that. I know some funding has come, but the question is sort of the difference in scale between the problem and the solution. And lastly, and sort of a shameless plug here, I and a mutual colleague and friend, Robert Metzger, wrote an op-ed in Real Clear Defense a number of months ago that called for a very significant investment in cyber resilience and hardening of critical infrastructures. The number we threw out was, I think, $250 billion could easily be spent in this area. Can you kind of get a reaction to that? Is additional funding on the way? Is it premature to be providing funding? Am I underestimating the degree of commitment to the government providing funds to the private sector to do this? Or how would you sort of characterize where we are in that regard?
So lots of questions
Sorry about that.
outlined. So let me talk about, let me kind of tackle those one at a time. So yes, I agree with your assessment. I've not read your op-ed, but I know you, and I know Bob Metzger. So this notion that there does need to be more investment in cybersecurity, I totally agree with that. How we arrive at doing that investment may be a couple of different paths that get pursued and that are part of the choreography that the National Cyber Director is sort of charged with leading. So one of the things that we need to look at really is what are the cybersecurity requirements for critical infrastructure owner operators for the private sector? Mm-hmm. And one of the things that we will soon be taking up, and this will be a venture that will be many years in the making, and that will be looking at regulatory harmonization. Mm-hmm. So we look at different infrastructures. We had an very up close and personal look at the regulatory infrastructure for the gas and oil, the pipeline industry on the heels of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. So. Mm-hmm. So we did that in partnership with that particular sector, leaders, CEOs of those companies, looking at what kinds of requirements, what is appropriate from a regulatory perspective, and what is implementable from an industry perspective. So there are other sectors that we're looking at: the healthcare sector, the water sector after that incident in Florida, where there was a small water treatment facility was subject to an attack. So how do we as a nation, or all these different regulatory regimes that we have, what are the requirements that we're placing on the private sector, that we're placing upon utilities, and that we're placing on those entities that are the overseers of these regulations? Do the overseers of the regulations actually have, the cybersecurity skills to provide appropriate oversight? Are the regulations, do we have a too heavy regulatory regime in one area and a too light regulatory regime in another? So that is an area we're going to focus on, is that regulatory harmonization. What are the best practices that need to be implemented immediately, and what are the stretch goals, that are necessary? And when you have those things, when you have that understanding, then you can begin to think through what are the resources necessary to actually follow through on hardening those systems. Now, from a resources perspective, This administration passed the Infrastructure and Investment in Jobs Act, the IIJA, and then more recently passed the the Chips and Science Act. And both of those pieces of legislation came with appropriations, great investments in infrastructure. So our role in the Office of the National Cyber Director, when we look at that investment, we want to ensure that those monies that are disseminated, that across the country at the state and local level, at small businesses or new startups are looking for grant monies from the National Science Foundation, or the companies that are looking at reshoring, onshoring, or nearshoring microelectronics fabs. How are they getting these monies? And then when they get these monies, how are they using them? If these funds are being used for developing capabilities, are these capabilities being developed with attention to life cycle risk management from a cybersecurity perspective? So we are in partnership with our other colleagues across the Executive Office of the President, Office of Science and Technology Policy, Office of Management and Budget, are working in partnership with these other organizations to ensure that these requirements for cybersecurity, go hand in glove with the investments that we're making in the country to, develop, with the National Science Foundation, innovation hubs. So that is one of the approaches that, this administration is taking from an investment perspective.
That's great. I appreciate it. The president's executive order 14028 on cybersecurity was a major step in promoting a more effective U.S. government posture to address growing cyber threats. Where does implementation of the EO stand across the federal government, and what do you see as some of the major accomplishments to date, and what work remains in that area?
Thanks for bringing that up. EO 14028. Having been in the government for many years, this was actually a very fascinating endeavor with this executive order. It's actually the longest executive order I've ever seen, and it was the first time that a government administration has been very clear in its requirements from a cybersecurity perspective with what our demands will be. So.
On each of the federal departments and agencies, yeah.
Right, and for the private sector, there are key elements within the executive order. Looking at like contract language of the private sector. If the government is going to buy things from the private sector, now the government will require evidence that the item, the good or the service, has been developed in a secure manner. So there will be requirements that a contractor seeking to do business with the government provide a software bill of materials or provide other artifacts to demonstrate that those capabilities have been developed in a secure environment, and that the necessary testing to ensure that the product will function as it is supposed to will have been done. So this is the first time that the bar has been raised so high from a government procurement perspective. So self-attestation, there's a role and room for self-attestation, but in certain situations, it's not going to be enough. There may be self-attestation where an entity has said, I have a third party who evaluated me, and I am here providing the evidence of that third party. Maybe that is enough, but under other circumstances, it might not be enough. So the requirements in EO 14028 included those types of activities. There was also a requirement to establish the Cyber Safety Review Board, which was actually kicked off earlier this year. The group convened the members of the Cyber Safety Review Board, which was modeled on the Transportation Safety Review Board, looking at disasters, either air, for airplane disasters or traffic incidents. So the first thing they looked at was the Log4j incident. Convened, they interviewed a number of people, and they produced a report with a series of recommendations on how to move forward on improving the development of open source software, the provisioning of open source software, and the means by which if we identify a vulnerability, rapidly push patches out, and the uptake of patches is done in an accelerated fashion. It's an important element that of that particular executive order, and I think it'll be interesting to see, over the next 5 years, how this board and the outcomes of the board's examination improve sort of the state of the art of cybersecurity from a steady state perspective. So those are some of the high level things that came out of that particular EO.
That's great. Earlier you mentioned one of the critical tools that the National Cyber Director has at his disposal in this case, and that is the responsibility to conduct annual reviews alongside the Office of Management and Budget of the budget proposals for the various federal departments and agencies to assess their cybersecurity posture and capabilities and budget spending programs, et cetera. How will this work in practice, and what specific metrics do you, Chris, and your colleagues intend to use to determine whether a particular department or agency's budget is adequate or not?
So for initial disclaimer, I'm not a budget professional, and we're not looking at any changes in FISMA, the legislation, that looks how agencies are postured from a information security perspective. And this is sort of a soft power where our budget team will work hand in glove with the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB examiners that have responsibilities to look at different agencies' expenditures. But because we're a new organization, we're 60 so people right now. And over probably the next 3 months, we will grow to a full strength of probably around 100 people. And that includes, White House fellows and maybe some interns here and there. So we will have the staff available to work in partnership with OMB, who will be able to do that deep dive into cyber. And many people appreciate that a deep dive in cyber is really a very horizontal look as well as a vertical look, because cyber cuts across so many different disciplines. You can't just go to an agency and ask the CIO what the cyber spend is, because there may be more than network operations that are being looked at.
Yeah, well, if you look at a DoD program, you can't really assess cybersecurity of a particular weapon system by solely looking at what the spending is for the CIO in the department, for example. So I get that completely. Let me shift gears briefly with you. And you talked about a key objective of the Office of the National Cyber Director is cyber workforce development, which is obviously a key question. And you noted that promulgating an effective and actionable national cyber workforce strategy is a central pillar of this effort. Can you tell us, Joyce, when such a strategy will be issued on cyber workforce development and what the central features of that strategy will be? And I'm hoping we didn't just lose Joyce temporarily. Hold on. There you are.
Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you heard the question, but on cyber workforce development strategy.
Yes, so excellent question, and there are a lot of people who are keenly interested in the topic. It's one of those topics that nobody is against it. So it's one that has fans in many different quarters. Probably 6 weeks ago, we hosted a workforce summit where Chris Inglis was able to bring in several people from the private sector, a number of cabinet level officials, the Secretary of Commerce, the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary of Education, and Labor, who all have very important roles in workforce education, but very different roles. And we hosted a summit, which was sort of our launch platform to then embark upon the development of a national, whole of nation development of a national cyber workforce strategy. And this is one that is focused in, this framing is sort of a strategic framing. looking at the few, the many, and the all, as Chris Inglis likes to characterize it. So the few are really those people who have a real need to, the jobs they perform require those individuals to actually have hardcore, cybersecurity expertise. These are people who are capability developers, they're network operators, they're network defenders. So they, no kidding, need a computer, they need to, have a graduate degree, matriculate from, an undergraduate, graduate institution, and have the necessary education and credentials to do that type of work. And then there's the category, the many. And these are the types of individuals who are in what people refer to now as cyber adjacent jobs. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that, where people actually need to understand cybersecurity and cyber operations, but don't necessarily need to have matriculated, have a computer science or engineering degree. For example, in the legal field, if there's a cyber incident where there's a bad actor has conducted something, and you have a law enforcement a professional who needs to do the forensic analysis to find out what actually happened, in what actually happened in what the incident being investigated, and then be able to take that information and provide it to a litigator, a prosecutor, a prosecuting attorney who knows and understands enough and can explain things to a jury of probably non-technical people, a very complicated topic. And then as well, the judges who preside over these, who sit over these proceedings have to be able to understand this information as well. So that is a field of cyber adjacent professionals. You're not going to get a computer scientist and send them to law school, or a law school graduate, and a law school graduate doesn't have to be doesn't have to have a computer science degree to actually be agile and articulate in this environment. So there are roles that are cyber adjacent that are that need a certain amount of training, separate and similar to what those who need the hardcore training. And then the all, in this construct of the few, the many, and the all, when we think about the all, that's really every citizen in the country. So everyone, K through 12, people who have had long, successful careers and are retired and trying to take advantage of, the time that they're retired and accessing services that are available digitally or can be only accessed through digital means. How can everyone in the country be able to thrive and prosper in a society, in a digital society? So when we think about our workforce education, we look at all of those. A important element from a workforce education perspective, a statistic I've heard recently is that there are 700,000 jobs that are going unfilled right now in both the government and the private sector. We're all looking at the same human capital pipeline. 700,000 positions that exist that are unfilled right now because we don't have the cyber professionals to put into those positions. So that our cybersecurity strategy for workforce development will definitely look at that. And I would also like to, for this particular audience, also point to the work being done by the Council on Competitiveness. And the Council on Competitiveness is looking at the next generation, the next 10 years of competition and successful advances of industry in our country. And a clear priority that they have is workforce development, because at the end of the day, if you're running a company, it's really the workforce that is your competitive edge in an environment where IT savvy is necessary across many different disciplines and is an important part of competitiveness. So the cyber workforce education isn't solely about the federal government finding talent to do things for those missions that the federal government performs, such as national security, but it's really about a national competitiveness requirement and a national competitiveness call to action.
Well, that's great, and I can tell you without question, in the national security space business, whether it's traditional companies or new start space companies, et cetera. This is a huge issue of being able to find talented
Mhm.
individuals with the right education, training, experience, including those, not only, but including those that have cyber expertise. And so this is a major problem. I've heard many CEOs from our member companies and other senior leaders in our member companies say that this is one of their biggest challenges, maybe even the biggest challenge, is being able to find talented, trained, well-educated people to fill a whole bunch of openings across their industry. So I appreciate you and Chris and others paying attention to this. I would also note that this is a big issue for the vice president. The vice president who chairs the National Space Council has made workforce development a critical issue. We applaud that. The National Space Council has a user is looking to restart a user advisory group led by General Les Lyles, who serves with NSSA, looking at this issue and various aspects of it. So we're all over this. Mandy Vaughn is leading a workforce development effort for us here at NSSA and doing a great job in that regard, working closely with the DoD and the IC, the Space Force, others, to look at how we can assist on that. So this is a key topic for industry for sure. Let me shift gears on you a little bit. We've got a bunch of other topics to cover and not a lot of time. So let me shift onto information sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs. As you know, space has its own ISAC that is the Space ISAC is very ably run by Ms. Erin Miller. In your view, what are the key functions of the ISACs that the ISAC should perform? How should the work of the various ISACs be integrated? And what recommendations do you or does the office have for the relatively new Space ISAC? What do you see as some of the unique challenges that are facing the space industry versus some of the other sectors? Could you hear that?
So I'm excited that yes, so it's fantastic that the space sector has established its own ISAC. So that's fantastic. What's so a couple of I'll answer the question on a couple of different levels. So first and foremost, certainly the private sector needs information that is actionable. It's not actionable to say, hey, bad guys, hack networks. There's greater level of specificity that is needed. And I know, coming from the intelligence community, we've been looking at, how to provide and how to deliver that actionable information in a way that it makes a difference. If the intelligence community isn't providing information that can be used, then there's no purpose in gathering that information. So that is an area of focus. An important thing from the private sector perspective to inform the intelligence community is to really share what information would be of greatest use. So what information actually makes a difference. So I'll give an example from a supply chain risk management perspective, based on a conversation I have had with many different venues, and I've gotten slightly different answers from different venues. So in talking to the private sector and asking about how companies do supply chain risk management and think about third-party risk, and I've asked what's when you're thinking about doing business with a third party, everyone's cautious, and everyone has a battalion of attorneys to help as the buffer to provide a level of protection, so that your contract language helps you guard against bad behavior or things that you don't want to happen. But what would cause someone to say, what evidence would cause someone to say that is not a third party I want to do business with? And one of the initial answers I got in this dialogue that I had with a number of different private sector entities was, well, evidence of malfeasance. If I were presented with evidence of malfeasance, I would not do business with that third party entity. But at the end of the day, that's really not true. Because inevitably, people are doing business with companies where there's derogatory information, where companies have misbehaved. So there needs to be a greater level of granularity in understanding what is bad behavior. So is there an employee who misbehaved? and the company immediately addressed that. So what are the attributes, the positive attributes that one would seek in a company? So you're looking for transparency and you're looking for responsibility. From a transparency perspective, who's making decisions in the company? That's something somebody would want to know. And then from a responsibility perspective, if an event happens, an employee misbehaves, or a cybersecurity breach has occurred, how quickly does the company act on that information, or has the company sat on that information for weeks on end? So responsibility and transparency are attributes one would seek. So that's from an ISAC perspective, from the information sharing perspective, what does industry really want to know? What are the key nuggets of information to a tactical and then a strategic perspective? So it's sort of a two-way street.
Right. And overall, how would you characterize the level of threat information sharing between, say, defense industrial-based companies and the U.S. government today? What can be done to further enhance that information sharing and collaboration? You've touched on a few things like making sure that the private sector knows what's important and how to ask for information, et cetera. But overall, what score would you give it at this point? And are there specific efforts that either ONCD is looking to undertake or others are undertaking? And is this more of a case of DHS CISA playing a critical role, or how would you describe the way ahead in this to really move the needle on our ability to share information that the government has or the private sector has, that two-way collaboration as you described it?
Well, first, I'm not really current with the type of information that's being shared with the space sector. So it's not that I've been routinely involved in, but I would point to a couple areas that I think are sort of best practices. And in the telecoms sector, there was legislation passed on the securing the. So it was a piece of legislation that looked at establishing 5G and requiring the government to invest in this. And in that particular piece of legislation, there was a requirement that the Department of Commerce, specifically NTIA, establish an information sharing group to include Homeland Security, law enforcement, and intelligence, and then mandated that information, information from that set of stakeholders be shared with the rural telecommunications providers. These are smaller companies that don't necessarily have the a heavyweight lobbying firm representing them in DC. Maybe there's something similar with the energy sector, where there are co-ops and small utilities in rural areas. So maybe there's a way to look at the success, the good, bad, and the ugly of those types of information sharing mandates, and see, well, what is needed now for this different environment that is the space sector, that is at one level very sophisticated, and then at another level being driven by emerging startups. It's a tech space that has all kinds of exciting promise to it, and tech startups may not have the same savvy that the more sophisticated, long-time defense industrial base firms might have in working with the government.
Thank you. I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. The first is something that's on a lot of people's minds these days, and that is ransomware attacks. How would you characterize the government and industry responses to date to the numerous and growing ransomware attacks? And what should companies be on the lookout? What are some best practices there that companies should consider?
Okay, so I would point to materials that CISA has produced and published on best practices, that they have on their external website. They also provide training on sort of best practices to deal with ransomware attacks. I think we're certainly learning more about how these events occur, and certainly immediately recognizing and identifying that an event has occurred is obviously it's an important first step. But my major recommendation would be looking to what what CISA has produced. And what they have produced is sort of a culmination of best practices that we have identified across the executive branch and with our international partners.
And you are, without question, one of the nation's foremost experts on supply chain security. And wanted to ask you, how would you characterize today the supply chain threat to U.S. companies, and in particular to companies that participate in the national security space market?
So certainly from a software perspective, since probably 2017 was sort of a watershed moment in software supply chain attacks. Mm-hmm. So that the software supply chain, what we saw with SolarWinds and other activities, other events, adversaries have certainly seen that the software element to systems is sort of a soft underbelly. So that's no longer news. That one needs to safeguard their software development and ensure that they have good practices and good hygiene in place there. So certainly we know adversaries are looking to exploit the supply chain, and I would say as we all lived through COVID, everyone learned about supply chain issues, predominantly logistics. The logistics element of a supply chain issue, where you would go down to a grocery store and some shelves would be filled with goods and other shelves would be bare and empty, and not because people had purchased everything, but because items hadn't arrived. Mm-hmm. And we certainly read media, the concerns expressed by different industries about shortages in microelectronics because factories aren't producing chips fast enough. The automotive industry and other industries that need microelectronics to build the components that they rely on. So coming off of that, when this administration actually was sworn in, one of the first executive orders that President Biden issued was Executive Order 14017, which is America's supply chains. And in that executive order, he directed numerous, agencies to look at 10 different sectors and look at shortages and risks and gaps in the supply chains for those 10 sectors. So this includes, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, the energy sector. So a variety of sectors. All this material, these studies have been done and they've been published and they've been they're available, on the White House website. But this was the first time that as a nation, we have baselined what the supply chain looks like. And you really can't make improvements on anything until you've actually baselined something. So for this particular industry, the space industry, I would certainly, point to what came out of the semiconductor study, the study on the information communications sector, maybe some examination of the study looking at advanced batteries and at the energy sector, and look at the supply chain issues flagged there, which include, looking at all of the soup to nuts sourcing, from minerals coming out of the earth to produce something that's made of metal, to the integration and then the delivery of a good or a service. So I would point the industry to, looking at those and seeing if these gaps are addressed, will these meet our requirements for our industry? If they're not addressed, where do I go to say, hey, this really matters to me? Or if there's a sequencing of priorities that this audience thinks needs to be recalibrated or revectored, item number 3 needs to be item number 1. Find a way to get that voice heard and get that information, known, because we are actually, the results of those studies, those gaps, are the types of things that are driving the decisions made for the CHIPS Act and for IIJA and for other activities that the administration is looking at being involved in.
Yeah, including investments in different areas, et cetera. Exactly. Makes sense. Well, I guess the last question I would pose to you, Joyce, is before we wrap up here is, where can audience members and including space companies and others go to find more information on the fine work of the Office of the National Cyber Director and other federal departments and agencies on emerging cyber and supply chain threats and best practices? You mentioned, of course, the CISA website and others, but how about for your organization, Chris Inglis's organization in particular? Or do you have sort of an open door policy to allow companies to come in and describe their issues, challenges, opportunities, et cetera? And how should they do that?
So certainly, we have a web page. We have a social media presence. We have Twitter accounts. So we are active in that particular environment. We have an organization that is our stakeholder engagement organization that will field requests. A CEO of a company wants to meet with the national cyber director. We will field that request through our stakeholder engagement folks and evaluate it and see what does the schedule look like, how best to be able to do that. But we're certainly very interested in hearing from this particular sector. And as we move forward in publishing our national security strategy, we are interested in hearing from this sector. And it would be ideally, are there mechanisms, maybe the ISAC is a best way of doing this. Is there a sector coordinating council where we convene, where there is one place that is a sort of a force multiplier that enables have a conversation with many instead of one at a time? That we're certainly interested in hearing from the sector.
That's great. Well, if you will share with me the point of contact for that, and others can reach out to NSSA, and we'd be happy to share that the contact information for the stakeholder engagement personnel. And I'm sure they'll be hearing from some of our member companies going forward. So Joyce, let me wrap up by saying thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. As always, you're on the top of your game, at the top of your game, and for sharing your insights. Keep up the fine work. And for those who watched today, we thank you for your time. For more information on NSSA, the only association devoted solely to the national security space enterprise, you can visit our website, which is www.nssaspace.org. And with that, we thank you for your participation. Have a great day. And Joyce, it's always wonderful to see you. And Chris is lucky to have you. Please give him my best.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Look forward to conversations.
Thanks. Out here.